The whole point of Prohibition is to make it illegal to sell wine. It wasn't illegal to make wine. You can go into a grocery store and you would find a rack of grapes in the vegetable section, fruits and vegetables, and there would be a sign with instructions on how to make your own wine.
Wow.
And it would be horrible.
As you probably know, the wine industry in California goes back some 250 years from when the Franciscan Padres brought wine grapes and vines to California, and then through its growth in the 19th century until it really exploded in the 20th century. So today, my guest, Kevin Ferguson, is going to talk to us about a really interesting piece of pivotal California wine industry history. And there's a direct link between Mission Santa Clara and the Jesuit fathers who took that over in the 1850s, and then later what happened to bring California wines to the forefront of the world wine industry. So I want to thank you, Kevin, for being here, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself and how this story got onto your radar.
Absolutely. This is great to be with you, Damien. And yeah, so we're embarking on the 50th anniversary of the Judgment of Paris, and that is the landmark event that transformed the wine industry worldwide, really, when two California wines blindly were picked by 9 French judges, no less, over the French elite wines in a famous blind tasting in Paris. And so that happened on May 24th, 1976. And, we're just on that 50th anniversary.
So tell us a little bit about what your background is and how this connects to you.
Yeah. So I grew up in a wine family. My great-grandfather was a winemaker in Italy and immigrated to California. And then in 1912, and my grandfather, Grandpa Mario Gemello, took it over, and he has a tie-in to the Judgment of Paris. He was actually retired in 2002 when they did a reenactment of the Judgment of Paris 25th anniversary rematch. Lo and behold, my grandfather's wine ended up winning that tasting, and it wasn't even supposed to be in the tasting, but it won. 14 out of 16 judges chose the Gemello Cabernet, the 1970 Gemello Cabernet, as the number one wine in the tasting, and the 2 judges that didn't picked it as the second best wine in that tasting. And so in my great-grandfather and my grandfather, they ran their winery all throughout the 20th century, starting in Prohibition, after Prohibition, and throughout the 20th century.
So how did your grandfather get his start in the wine industry?
So, well, he was my grandfather, Grandpa Mario, was 17 years old in 1934. He was a senior at Mountain View Union High School when Prohibition got repealed, and so he helped his father, John Gemello, or Giovanni Gemello, to relaunch the Gemello winery. But he was great-grandpa Gemello, came from Italy in 1912. He was a winemaker and had a vineyard in Piedmont, northern Italy. And he was struggling, 3 out of 4 years. He was working, when he was in his 20s, he was working at Martini and Rossi sparkling vineyards. And then in the evenings, he would tend to his own grapes. And 3 out of 4 years, the harsh winters would wipe out his crops, and he was getting frustrated. He had friends who had already emigrated to California, and they would write him letters and say, look, you're making 10 cents a day in Italy, or making $1 a day in California. You should come out and join us. And ultimately he did.
Wow. So it's funny. My grandfather, my father's father, came to the United States, came to California in 1912, also from
Wow.
Austro-Hungary,
Okay.
um, but was their region of Dalmatia had for a long time been under Venice, and so there's a lot of
Mm,
Italian tie-ins there as well.
right.
But Martini and Rossi, they're still in business. I reckon
Yeah.
they make vermouth, right?
Yep.
And
That's what I knew of them from. I bartended out of college and actually during college, and that's the brand of vermouth that we were using for martinis.
okay, so
Yeah.
when your great grandfather then came to California, where did he wind up settling, and how did he how did he get into the business here?
Yeah, so that's actually a fascinating story, and this takes us even back to the 19th century. He did come in 1912, but he landed a job at Almaden Vineyards, which was run by Paul Masson. Now, Paul Masson, in the 1800s, he came from France, an immigrant from France. He would eventually be known as the Champagne King of California. But when he first came here, he landed a job at New Almaden, it was called, run by Charles Lafranc. And that became one, if not the first, one of the first commercially run wineries in California. And 1878, I think Charles Lafranc was killed by a runaway. And so he ended up handing down in his will to his three children. One of them was a woman, Louise, who Paul Masson was actually dating and eventually married the next year. But he wasn't loving being part of. He wanted to run his own shop, and he also was. I think in 1892 he launched his first brand of champagne. Like I said, he came from France, and I think in the Burgundy region, and um, he made his first brand of sparkling wine, which was, they were calling it champagne at the time, which they're not supposed to call it now after 2005, but he became known as the Champagne King of California. When my great grandfather ended up working for him, he finished in 1913. He ended up completing a big project, and he went to go blow off steam at a local watering hole, an Italian watering hole called the Costa Hotel in San Jose, downtown San Jose. And he bumps into somebody he knew from Italy. It was Giovanni Beltramo. Now, anybody who's lived on the San Francisco Peninsula, they usually know that name, Beltramo, because the Beltramo Wine and Spirits liquor store in Menlo Park has been there for 132 years. It's been run by 5 generations of Beltramos. And
Wow.
Giovanni Beltramo was the patriarch of that lineage. And so my great grandfather bumps into him at the card table, and Giovanni Beltramo says, "Gemello, I didn't know you were here. Where's your wife and daughter?" And he goes, "Well, I had to leave him behind in Italy, and I'm trying to make some money. And when I have the money, I'm going to send for them." And Beltramo knew what it was like that story hit him in the heart because he knew what it was like to be alone in a foreign country. He too had to send for his wife when he made some money. And so he loaned my great grandfather, $190, which was the equivalent of $5,000 in today's dollars, for his wife and daughter to come and join him. So,
Wow. Okay, so I remember when you mentioned Paul Masson, I remember when I was a kid, those commercials with Orson Welles.
right.
He'd say, "We will
Yeah.
sell no wine before it's time." So these are all names that are familiar to me. So So that's great. So I'm assuming he sends for your great grandmother and your
Hmm.
grandmother,
Yep.
and so they come to California, and then what happens?
So about a year later or so, I mean, my great grandmother had to settle um, some issues and sell some land and so forth to come over. And when she does come over, actually, she comes over around the next year or so, and my great grandfather ends up getting a job at Piketty Winery on Montebello Road in Cupertino, which is a pretty famous wine district. Now it's predominantly ridge wineries at the top of the mountain, along with Vidovich, and there is a Piketty uh, tasting room at the bottom there right now. But so he ends up getting a job at Piketty, and what's funny is this is a story that is on an old cassette tape that my great grandfather had recorded in the late 1970s when he was like 97, 98, before he died at the age of almost 99. And just to fast forward a little bit, my grandfather, Grandpa Mario, in 2002 got diagnosed with prostate cancer. And so a bonding project that we did together was to transcribe these tapes. And my great grandfather had a heavy Italian accent. So we would listen to the tape, we would stop it periodically. My Grandpa Mario would uh, interpret what we just heard, and I would type it into my computer. So um, he ends up he needed a bigger house because he's no longer going to be, his bachelor days in California were going to be over, as his wife and daughter were coming. And so he tells the story on the cassette tape about renting a house just off of the Piketty property. It was owned by the Piketty brothers. And the reason why it was vacant was because there was poison oak all over the place. And the guy who was going to rent it got spooked by the poison oak. And so my Grandpa Mario stopped the tape, and he, repeated what we had just heard and said, I don't think you have to put all that. That's just trivial information. But and I agreed. And he goes, but just put the date that they moved in there. They moved in on New Year's Eve, 1915. And I also agreed. I thought those were trivial details. And then he goes, he also said it rained for 4 days. I don't think you have to put that either. And I said, well, wait a second. Now all those details are important. I'm starting to figure this out. And he goes, well, what do you mean? He goes, well, think about it. He was a bachelor for a year. His wife comes to live with him. They move in on New Year's Eve, 1915. It rains for 4 days. 8 months and 27 days later, you were born.
You're a quick thinker.
Yeah. So, but what's super fascinating about the Piketty family? So the Pikettys in the 19th century, the 1800s, 1880, 1870 or so, they were working for the Jesuits of Santa Clara and making wine for the local church parishes there. And with that money, they ended up buying the property at the bottom of the hill of what became Montebello Road.
Mm.
And they are the ones credited with naming it Montebello, which in Italian means beautiful mountain.
Mm-hmm.
And so they used that money to, it's two brothers, Vincenzo and Secondo. Secondo is second in English. And those two brothers ended up building the Piketty Winery. And then Vincenzo's two sons are the ones that my great-grandfather ended up working for.
I see. Okay. So, and all of this really has, when you think of wine in California, at least most of us, we don't think of the Santa Clara Valley or the San Jose area. But what you're telling us is that this really was an epicenter for wine in the late 19th, early 20th century.
Yeah, it was actually it was a very popular industry in those days, and um, in so when we talk about the Judgment of Paris in 1976, California had about 350 wineries, but the reason why the Judgment of Paris is so pivotal and a turning point is because California and the U.S.'s wine industry was in repair from Prohibition for 40 years. And it had peaked in that 20th century in 1910 with 1,000 wineries. And then we lost about 400 of those wineries as Prohibition was looming. And by 1920, we were down to 600 wineries. So my great grandfather was actually working, as I said, at Piketty Winery in 1915. In 1917, he ended up taking some of the money he had made and purchased a vineyard up on top of Montebello Road. And he only held on to it for 2 years because Prohibition was looming, and he sold it in 1919, and then ended up pivoting when Prohibition became law, and pivoted into the technology of the day, which was cars. He and a couple of business partners invested in basically a traveling farmers market, bought a fleet of trucks, and would deliver vegetables house to house throughout the Santa Clara Valley. And they would, and nowadays in Santa Clara Valley, it's wall to wall apartment complexes and houses. But back in those days, even in the 1970s, it was orchards spaced out between all these, every house, there were big orchards. And so you needed, some kind of mode of transportation. And, 1920s was when, cars and trucks were becoming more popular.
Yeah, it's really funny to think that most of us now, when we think of the area, what is known officially as the Santa Clara Valley, we talk about it as Silicon Valley. So it's really, unless you go there and spend a little time and dig into the history, you don't realize that the Santa Clara Valley, what is today Silicon Valley, was really an agricultural region for a long time in the
Absolutely.
20th century. Yeah. So can you maybe backtrack a little bit and let's talk about Prohibition? I mean, we all sort of have a vague idea, I think, or a lot of people, maybe some people don't know really what was Prohibition and what was its impact on the United States.
Yeah. So, Prohibition was actually looming as far back as 1893. And it was really pushed by the Anti-Saloon League. And there was a guy named, I'm blanking on his first name, but the last name is Wheeler. And he was actually, he was traumatized as a little kid, where he got struck by a pitchfork as a little kid on his family's farm by somebody who was, really belligerent and drunk. And so that's what really pushed him to, fight against alcohol. But he wasn't really getting much traction until the early 1900s. And in 1905, he, started to connect with other temperance movements. And so through that, they were able to build some steam. From between 1905 to 1917, several states had actually passed anti-liquor laws. California was not one of them. Four ballot initiatives came to the voters in California, and they all failed, and partly because had a heavy Italian and German and Irish popularity or community in San Francisco, which was the biggest city in California until maybe in the mid 1920s. And so all those anti-liquor laws failed up until one thing that really flipped the switch was they were a lot of states were concerned about losing the revenue that came from alcohol sales tax. But in 1916, the 16th Amendment was passed, and that's what gave us income tax, federal income tax. That's why we're paying federal income tax. So, and then that was helpful for the federal government to and the states to eliminate or not be so heavily dependent on alcohol sales tax. And so in 1920, it went into effect after it passed in 1919. And so for 14 years, alcohol was banned from 1920 to 1933. But there was a loophole in California law that my great-grandfather was able to take advantage of. And in 1925, he ended up buying a 30-acre ranch in Mountain View that he was going to eventually turn into his winery when it would get repealed in 1933. But basically, stepping back to what that loophole was, is it allowed homeowners to produce up to 200 gallons of wine for home use, which is actually a staggering amount. That's the equivalent of 3 bottles a day, every day, for 365 days a year for home use. And so my great-grandfather ended up carving out, well, I don't know exactly when he did this, but he did carve out a portion of his, I think he first carved out 8 acres for Zinfandel grapes. And then in 1933 or sometime after that, that vineyard ended up growing about 18 acres of Zinfandel grapes. So in 1928 or 29, he ended up, those grapes were starting to produce the ability to be harvested for wine. And by 1933, he was ready to open for business.
So there's a couple of interesting dynamics there. First of all, that there was already this movement in favor of banning alcohol. And although it didn't pass in certain states like California, and the federal government was unwilling to move on it, and I'm assuming that means the Congress, because of the tax losses, the revenue losses they would have. So what you said is then once we passed the income tax, then then Congress felt like they had an open door to go ahead and pass this policy, pass this law. And then you're saying that people knew after a while that it was eventually going to be repealed. So it seems like there's these waves of popular sentiment that come and go, and it seems like that's what happened in the 20s and 30s.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could say that that's a pretty simplistic approach of looking at the events that unfolded. But I mean, a lot of that was, I mean, so one of the first things that happened that really, I mean, it wasn't a really popular thing. It was, but also it was kind of a facade, because they never really hired the amount of enforcement that would be necessary to, you have to have all these enforcement officers going, to all these saloons and underground speakeasies to break them up, and that was rarely done. And then on top of that, in 1929, of course, we had the market crash of 1929 that sent the country into a massive depression, um, and then and so that's another thing that and then along with that we had bank failures, because everybody was pulling their money out of their banks and stashing it under their mattress. So we had 2,000 banks failing in in the first 2 years of the Great Depression, and so a lot of those things also were impacting the Great Depression and Prohibition. And that's one of the things, repealing Prohibition or the 18th Amendment was one of the things that FDR campaigned on.
Oh, so by that time, it was pretty clear that the country would have been behind getting rid of Prohibition. Interesting. Yeah, and so why do you think they passed the law to begin with if they didn't put the teeth into enforcing it?
So I'm not really a historian on that, but what I do know is it was a strong, they were gaining. It was, I mean, without getting into Republican versus Democrat debates, but in that era they were. It was a political ploy to get campaign votes, really.
Yeah.
Okay. And you get the women temperance movement. They had a pretty strong apparatus throughout state by state, as opposed to Wheeler and his anti-saloon league before he joined forces with them. And so it was a really strong apparatus, state by state, to get that campaign promises for elections.
I see. So it was pretty opportunistic at the time.
Right.
Okay, so then they get through Prohibition. Prohibition is repealed, and so you can make wine again legitimately, commercially. So then what happens?
Yeah, so, and actually, one other fascinating story about in Prohibition, and the whole point of Prohibition is to make it illegal to sell wine. It wasn't illegal to make wine.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can go into a grocery store and you would find a rack of grapes in the vegetable section, fruits and vegetables, and there would be a sign with instructions on how to make your own wine.
Wow.
And it would be horrible. It would be horrible wine, because it was what they were selling was known as Alicante Boucher grapes, because it's very thick skin and it was easy to transport by train.
Okay.
And so that's the type of wine that homemakers were drinking during Prohibition. And then when Prohibition was repealed, we had, like I said, about 300 wineries that had survived making sacramental wine for the church, which was another loophole in Prohibition law. And then we went up to about, I think, 800 wineries pretty rapidly, but many of them went out of business almost as fast as they opened because um, the palate for Americans at that time was strikingly different from drinking that Alicante Boucher wine. So we ended up dropping down to 400 wineries again, and it bottomed out. I mean, things would fluctuate in the 50s, but in 1965 we bottomed out to 225 wineries, and then it would slowly increase by the time we got to 1976 with the Judgment of Paris, where we had roughly 350 wineries. When news broke that California beat France in that blind tasting that was published in Time magazine by George Tabor, who was the European correspondent for Time, California wine almost skyrocketed in demand overnight. And so over the next several years, we would start to see boutique wineries opening up. And then throughout the next 25 years, by the year 2000, we got back to 1,000 wineries. So it took 90 years to get back to where we were peaked at 1910 with 1,000 wineries.
Wow. So the mid 60s were sort of the bottom of the wine culture in California. That's really interesting. So what do you think happened between, well, you said earlier that Californians' palates didn't really like the type of wine that was being produced. So what do you think changed between then and then, bottoming out in the 60s, and then this quality jumping to the point that it could win a French wine competition, a world wine competition in the mid 70s?
I mean, we're talking, 30, 40 years. So it's not something that is just, one thing. It's a series of things probably. And, as I don't really have a lot of insight into, how much people were drinking beer versus wine in the 60s or whiskey or rum. But it's things would fluctuate, and it we had a number of ups and downs that would get us up to and 350. I mean, right now we have 4,800 wineries, so we ended up after the year 2000, more than 70 or 80% of the wineries that exist today started in the last 25 years. I mean, we're having, the wine industry again is going through quite a bit of a decline as a result of Gen Zers not drinking as much, climate change, or if Gen Zs are drinking, they're drinking, a variety of cocktails instead of wine or beer. And so, the peak, I think, was around 2017. And then we would see a little bit of a blip of wine drinking or a little rise during COVID lockdown. And then since then, it's been on the decline ever since. But it's nothing, the decline is nothing compared to what it was like in the 60s and 70s, where we only had 350 wineries. Now, we still have 4,800. I mean, a lot of the wineries now they are having, a lot of challenging times, and probably don't like saying that, oh, things are much better than they were compared to the 70s. But, it's, 4,800 is a lot more than 350.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, I I remember, as I mentioned, growing up in the Napa Valley, I remember being around wineries all the time. But, in recent years, when I would return there and see the number of wineries that have sprouted up all over the place, I would even ask myself, well, how can the economy support? Are there this? Are there that many people drinking wine?
Right.
So it's probably natural. It should contract a bit
Mhm.
again. But what about your family? So how did they manage to get through this difficult period and then um, kind of reach that pinnacle in terms of the wine world?
Yeah, I mean, it's it is a fascinating history and story. I mean, a lot of it is so. As I mentioned earlier, that my great grandfather had 18 acres of Zinfandel grapes in the 1930s, but by 1940 he ended up selling off part of that vineyard, and he would end up. My grandfather, Grandpa Mario, ended up taking over the wine business, the day-to-day operations. My great grandfather stayed on he was semi-retired, but you know, um, even in those times, Mountain View, we had NASA being built out there, and it was not nearly what it is today in terms of real estate, but it was growing. At one point, I think they had 3,000 residents, and then within 5 years, they'd be up to 5,000 residents. And so, it just made economic feasible sense for my great grandfather to sell off or use part of his orchard for other purposes, and then he could buy his grapes from other vineyards in the area, in Cupertino and Saratoga, uh, and the like. So, it's the early days of being a savvy real estate um, investor, kind of.
That's interesting. They makes me think of that movie about, I guess, Ray, was it Ray Kroc, the guy that built McDonald's
Oh,
into such a big,
right, the
yeah,
founder,
yeah, the
founders,
founder,
yeah, yeah,
exactly, that movie, and the whole thing was not so much what he did with hamburgers, but what he did with real estate.
right, right, yeah. So it's interesting because my grandpa Mario didn't really talk about his real estate, but every now and then we would see, he passed away in 2005, um, or I'd read, some old newspaper clipping in the San Jose Mercury News that he was a part owner of some property, in the San Francisco Peninsula. And my grandmother, who actually is still alive at 104 years old, um, she never really liked to know about the business dealings. Not that she just was disinterested. It wasn't like anything was shady. It was just that she just didn't care. And so, even though, and I spent a lot of time with her during the pandemic lockdown, um, because we had to lay off her caregiver until we got a vaccine. So, but, you know, I would spend a lot of time going through old newspaper clippings and I would ask her certain things. And if it was business related, she really didn't have much insight into that she could share with me.
Now, we talk about this judgment in Paris is such a huge thing for California wines. I'm assuming that until that time, California wines were not winning competitions. Is that right?
Uh, so I mean, that they had, my grandfather would have a lot of local or California state wine wine events. I don't think that there were. Well, I guess every number of years, at the World Fair, they probably had them. Because I know in 1915, when the World Fair came to San Francisco, um, for the celebrating the opening of the Panama Canal, um, a number of California wines won that tasting. Um, as far as international tastings, I don't have a lot of insight into that. I know that Rixford, which was a very popular woodside winery in at the turn of the 20th century, they won the Paris um, or the Paris gold medal at the Paris World Fair, I think in 1900. Um, and so I don't have a lot of, I haven't come across a lot of international um, tastings. It doesn't mean that they didn't win or they didn't have them. Um, but after 1976, I mean that it it just became a huge ordeal.
So, what do you think was the impact then of that judgment?
Well, I mean, everybody was intrigued with California wine after that. I mean, you can go into George Tabor. In fact, we talk about that Judgment in Paris a little bit because it was really fascinating how it all came about, and it almost didn't get any publicity whatsoever. So it was run by a guy named Stephen Spurrier, who was he ran a Paris wine shop, and he was looking for a way to promote his wine shop. And he was often hosting, it was located near a lot of the foreign embassies in Paris. And they would have special tastings inviting the embassy members of the embassy of the foreign embassies to taste their own wines. And he had a business partner named Patricia Gallagher, who was actually from the U.S. She was from Delaware. And Stephen Spurrier, if I hadn't mentioned it yet, he was a British expat. He
Okay.
previously worked in the British wine trade, and then he ended up taking over the Caves de Madeleine, which is an interesting story, but we can come back to that.
Yeah, let's come back to it.
And so Patricia Gallagher, who ran the French wine school next door, went off to California on vacation. She did a number of wine tastings, came back and told Stephen Spurrier that we have to do a California tasting. And Stephen Spurrier said, I'm not opposed to it, but we need a raison d'être. We need a reason to do it. We need a marketing angle. And she goes, well, it's a no-brainer. We got to do it for the bicentennial and American independence. Stephen Spurrier said, well, she said, it's a big deal. And Stephen Spurrier said, is it? We never celebrated in England, having lost the war. But Stephen Spurrier wasn't one to ignore a marketing opportunity. And so, sure enough, he went along with it. And so he pitched the story idea to a number of French media, Le Monde, L'Express, Le Figaro, and they all universally rejected the story idea, figuring that if France is going to win the tasting, there's no story. And he also pitched it to George Tabor, the European correspondent of Time, and he was also skeptical, but he was familiar with the wine shop because he had taken a wine course at the wine school next door. So a couple of things fell into place to make it work or make it worth his while to attend it. It was going to be held on the slowest news day of the week. It was held on Monday. Time magazine went to print on Fridays. And so if nothing came out of that event, it wasn't a big loss to Tabor. So um, he shows up there and not expecting a story to come out of it. And it was about halfway through the white wine tasting that he started to realize that a story was actually brewing. And since he was fluent in French, he knew what all the French judges, there were 9 French judges, what they were saying. And they talked a lot during the tasting. And he had, worked in Europe for 7 years, so he was fluent in French. And uh, Spurrier gave him a scorecard and a list of the wines that they were drinking. And so he was one of the few people who knew what was being tasted. And one of the judges, as he was tasting one of the white wines, held it up, uh, raised the glass, took a sip, smelled it, and said, "Ah, back to France." And Tabor looked at his scorecard and realized that the judge had just tasted Freemark Abbey from Napa Valley.
Wow.
And so that's when he realized that there was probably a story here after all. And so, sure enough, Stag's Leap won the Cabernet category, the red category, and Chateau Montelena ended up winning the white wine category.
Wow. Wow, that's interesting. I did not know that, especially the tie-in with the bicentennial.
Mm-hmm.
So now we're at 50 years later,
Mm-hmm.
and the wine industry, the wine culture is completely different. American wines are huge. And how did that affect your family?
So, an interesting story. I could tell you a story about how this really kind of, that the Judgment of Paris is probably part of what influenced my cousins, the Obisters, that ended up going into the wine business and ended up buying the Gemello wine label from my grandfather when he retired, 1982. But how they got into the wine business is a fascinating story that is probably, a great little nugget right after the Judgment of Paris. And because they ended up running what was considered a boutique winery, one of the, as boutique wineries started to explode in the late 70s and 1980s. And in the early 1970s, my great grandfather had just lost his wife of 70 years. And so they met in Italy. In fact, when they were kids, they were 12, I think 12 and 13 years old, and then ended up getting married, in their, I think, early 20s. And she passed away, I think, in 72 or 73. And so Sandy and Paul Obister, who Sandy was John Gemello's granddaughter, she ends up taking him in, and they had a house in Palo Alto. And my great grandfather was pretty depressed from losing his wife, but also he was, he was long retired, but also he had one of his hobbies was gardening. And sometime in his 80s, he had a pitchfork incident, where a self-imposed pitchfork incident, might kind of sound like Wheeler, but Wheeler was not self-imposed. But he struck his knee and injured it. And over time, it got worse and worse. Knee replacement surgery wasn't popular at the time. That would have done wonders for him. But so it was hard for him to get on his knees and play in the dirt and do his gardening. So Sandy was often trying to come up with ways to inspire him, and one day she and Paul said, "Grandpa, why don't you show us how to make a barrel of wine?" And he was intrigued by that, but he said, "Well, let me think about it." A couple months go by, and Paul ends up bringing up the topic again, and he goes, "Okay, so," and in his broken English, he's like, "First, you get a a ton of grapes," and Paul goes, "No, no, no! I just want to make a barrel. We don't need to make a whole massive amount." And he goes, "Well, I only know a one way." Paul goes, "That's okay. I know how to divide by two. Go ahead and tell me your recipe." And so for 2 years in a row, they made some homemade wine. And then in 77 or 78, they ended up going out and looking for a property to launch their own winery. And they ended up buying an old barn in Half Moon Bay, right off of 92 and Highway 1. And that became they converted that barn into a winemaking operation, which would be there for 25 years.
So Half Moon Bay is about, what, half hour, 40 minutes south of San Francisco? Is that right?
Yeah, about that. Yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah, no problem. So, and then in 19, so that was 78. 1982 is when my grandfather Mario retired, and he sold the wine label, and he taught them his recipe for his Cabernet, for basically red wine. And then they would continue to make, they made Oberster predominantly throughout that era, but I think they made about 500 cases of Gemello, Cabernet, and Zinfandel during that era. They also purchased some land in Mendocino, I think in 1990, and that would be they moved their winemaking operation there it would be there for about 6 years, and then they ended up selling it to Duckhorn, which is a very popular wine brand. It was actually Goldeneye was the vintage, or the wine that they produced out of that Mendocino property under the Duckhorn umbrella. It's still in operation.
Oh, great. That's great.
So, yeah.
So then you said that there was another story that you wanted to mention that had to do with the judgment that.
Yeah. So I think so there's a couple of good stories. I don't remember exactly which one I was going to tell at that point, but basically
doesn't matter.
It's interesting how it's interesting how it is this story on how Spurrier ended up buying calves to Madeleine.
There we go.
So he was in his early 20s or mid 20s. He had just moved, him and his wife, to France. And like I think I mentioned earlier, he was in the London wine trade for 2 years before he came over. And he was walking around one day in Paris with a lawyer friend of his, also a British expat. And they walked by the Casa Madeleine, and Steven Spurrier said, "That's the kind of shop I'd like to own someday." So they walk into the wine shop, and
Casa de Madeleine is a wine shop, is a well-known wine shop. Okay,
right. And so they walk into the wine shop, and they bump into the owner, and she says, "Can I sell you something?" And the lawyer says, "Yeah, you could sell your shop to my friend." And she kind of laughs and says, I don't. This is my husband's pride and joy, and I don't think you can hold a candle to, an Englishman can hold a candle to my husband, who he had passed away 2 years earlier. And she was actually secretly trying to sell the wine shop. And so Stephen Spurrier, he wasn't hurting for money. He came from a wealthy family. So he said to the lady and said, look, I'm willing to strike a deal with you. I'm willing to work for you for free for 6 months to learn the Paris wine trade. And if you're satisfied after 6 months, you can sell it to me. So he ended up working there for 6 months. And then in April of 1971, he sold him the shop.
Wow. And is that the shop that became the shop where they held the competition, the Judgment in Paris?
No, I don't believe it was held at the shop. I think it was held at a hotel. No, I've read that, but I don't recall which hotel it was held at.
Okay. Yeah, but I mean, it was through his shop there,
Yeah,
that shop, that he organized it.
yeah, absolutely.
So when do you think this? No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, he did a number of things to change the wine shop. She was selling inexpensive wines, catering to the locals, and his idea was to cater to the wealthy foreigners that worked nearby, because all the foreign embassies were nearby. There were a lot of big law firms that were nearby, and he just saw that as a huge opportunity to increase the value. And also, as he's told the story, he passed away in 2021, but over the years he's done a lot of interviews, and he mentioned that there weren't a lot of the French didn't speak English in the 1970s in Paris. And so he ended up taking out an ad in the International Herald Tribune saying that your wine merchant speaks English. And so that's one way that he was trying to build a clientele of expats and wealthy foreigners that were living in Paris at the time.
Wow. So what would you say that this episode, this famous Judgment in Paris, can teach us about California, about California's relationship with wine and the rest of the world?
I mean, it's definitely, I think one of the reasons why it's a really fascinating story is it's a cultural turning point, but it's also a California underdog story where, internationally it was not very well respected, partly because of Prohibition. And, during Prohibition, the schools that did teach viticulture, UC Davis and Fresno State, which actually they weren't called those universities at the time, but they're still around. They stopped teaching viticulture, and so there was a massive loss of knowledge. So a lot of the winemakers at that time either went to other countries or went into completely different industries, and so we lost a lot of knowledge. And so it's I don't know, I just think it's a fascinating and exciting underdog story. That who doesn't love an underdog story?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you. Are there any other stories that you think we need to hear, or that we've left out in this episode?
I think we pretty much covered it. I mean, one of the fascinating stories, if we go back to Prohibition, is about A.P. Giannini and the guy who started Bank of Italy. And Bank of Italy really initially it catered to the Italian farming community, immigrant farming community. He was he got his start working delivering vegetables in a horse-drawn wagon as well, similar to my great-grandfather. And in 1930, he was one of the so after the 1929 market crash happened, and then there was another double whammy, you may say, regarding a lot of the farming community, where there was a massive uh, harsh winter freeze that went across Santa Clara Valley and pretty much wiped out my grandfather's vegetable business for
Wow.
a while. And so he ended up going to Bank of Italy. And one of the things that he did, AP Giannetti did to cater heavily to the Italian immigrant community, he posted the hours both in Italy and Italian and in English. And so my great grandfather got a loan for two purposes. He got a loan for money to live on for that year, but also to buy a new tractor. And he used that tractor in the mornings on his own property, and then he would rent it out to other people for extra cash. And in 1930, AP Giannetti, really perfected the banking business using the Italian immigrant community as a model, and then he started to branch out to other ethnicities, such as the Chinese and so forth. And in late 1930, he ended up rebranding the bank. Do you know the name? Bank of America.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that was one of the few banks that would survive in the banking crash of the Great Depression. And one of the ways that he did that is that he brought interest rates close to zero. And then he got the contract to, or he gave a $2 million loan to an engineer who was going to build the Golden Gate Bridge. And a stipulation for that loan would be that he had to use a lot of the Italian immigrants that were out of work.
Very interesting. Clever. I had no idea.
Yep. Yeah.
That's well. See, it's funny to see how all of these. You take one episode, one story, and it's tied into so many others.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah, but I think that's the great thing about history is beyond the facts and figures. It is really story, right? And one story leads to another and is connected to another, and usually, in many cases, there's also a personal connection that we can find, right? As in the case of your family. So I really want to thank you, and we'll definitely add the URLs for your work. I know you have a newsletter on Substack. Am I correct?
Yeah. If anybody is interested in these stories, I often write many of these stories and behind the scenes research and stories for an upcoming book that I'm working on. My Substack, if you'd like to subscribe to my Substack, you can find it. It's called the Centenarian Playbook. It's partly about the Gemello Winery, but also about my Grandma Kay's longevity journey at 104 years old. Centenarian Playbook or gemello.substack.com.
All right. Well, we'll definitely let everybody know that. And I want to thank you. This was really interesting and a great glimpse into a world event that really has a direct connection to our history here in California. So
awesome. I really appreciate it, Damien. It was a lot of fun retelling these stories and learning about you as well.
All right. Well, if you have any other stories, you just let me know and we'll bring you back on.
Sounds good. All right. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.